Okay, today's daf is Kuf Aleph 101, and we are beginning at the last two lines of Kuf Amid Beis 100b. Gave the introduction yesterday, there's a concept of Kiddush B'Makom Suda. There's an obligation from the Torah to recognize Shabbos, to pronounce Shabbos at its start. That's the sanctification of Shabbos Kiddush, which means sanctification. And that's from the Seres Adibros, where it says, Zochor es Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho. Make a remembrance for Shabbos to sanctify it. And the Chacham said to do so over a cup of wine, as we do Shira L'Yayin, everything essentially that we do in Kedusha, we do over a cup of wine. This Kiddush that we have to do, Shmuel is of the opinion it has to be done b'makom suda, the place of the meal, as Yeshayahu Navi says, you should call Shabbos, pronounce Shabbos, a delight, and this oneg, this pleasure, delight, which is represented in the meal, is also the place that you would call your kiddush, call Shabbos. So there was a minhag. It's still prevalent in many of the community shuls. It was before the war. It was the most prevalent minhag in all Ashkenazi communities that Friday night they make kiddush in shul after davening before Aleinu. And they would say kiddush. The chazan would say kiddush and give some of the wine of the kiddush or the grape juice to some of the kids in attendance. This is Kiddush and Friday night shul. This was the minhag in the times of the Rishonim, as well as the minhag in the times of the Gemara. And so the Gemara addresses that Kiddush made in shul because you're making Borei Pri Hagafen. Does that cover everybody that goes home and wants to drink wine? Two, they're saying Kiddush. Does that cover anybody? So the people that made Kiddush in shul, so the chazan or whoever it is that made the Kiddush. Amar Rav says, Yidei yayin lo yatsu. They cannot fulfill the obligation of wine that they had made, because, meaning the Borei Pri Hagafen, because they're changing places. They're moving from where they are right now. They're going home, and that's not going to be a fulfillment of the bracha for when they get home, because there's a shinui makom, there's a change in the place from where they went into where they're going, and even though that they knew they were going home, that constitutes a hesach hadas, a interruption in the intent of drinking, and they need a new bracha when they get home. However, yedei kiddush yatzim. They did fulfill their obligation to Kiddush. They made Kiddush, and so that's going to be sufficient. However, Shmuel says an hour on Kuf Aleph, Amid Aleph, 101 at the top, Af Yidei Kiddush Lo Yatzu. They would also not have fulfilled the obligation of making Kiddush, because, as we said, Kiddush has to be b'makom suda. The Kiddush has to be made at the place of a meal. And the Kiddush you made in shul Friday night, that the chazan made, there was no meal attached to that. And so, therefore, when they made Kiddush, they will not have fulfilled the obligation and have to come home and make Kiddush again. So the Gemara says, so according to Rav, if you made Kiddush in shul and fulfilled the obligation, why would somebody come home and make Kiddush again at their meal? It says, to cover the children and the household members that were not in shul, that did not hear Kiddush, so you make it again. And indeed, if somebody's coming home and everybody was in shul and heard the Kiddush in shul, so then they would not have to make Kiddush at home again. That's what would be the indication, according to Rav. Shmuel said, no, you did not fulfill the obligation of Kiddush, because you need Kiddush b'makom suda. You need Kiddush at a place of a meal. So so where did this custom come from to make Kiddush in shul Friday night at the end of the davening? After all, there's no meal there, so you're not fulfilling the Kiddush. Where it says it was established lafuke orchim yedei vasan, to help guests that are going to be eating out of the communal coffers in shul. And this was a common thing. We had a guest come to town. So where would they stay? They would sleep in shul, and the shul would provide them a meal. So they would eat in shul. So they needed kiddush. So the chazan would make kiddush, and that would fulfill the obligation of kiddush for those guests who were eating over there, and the achla v'shasa v'gana b'mei kiddush, because they're eating and drinking and sleeping in the shul, and therefore this became the custom that every week it made kiddush whether there were guests or not, just in case that there are guests and somebody that doesn't have a meal and is going to be eating there. This would cover them, and remain the custom even if there were no guests sleeping in shul. And that's the reason you make the kiddush in shul, but not to fulfill anybody's obligation that's going home, because they wouldn't, because it has to be at a meal. Vaza Shmuel Tameh, and here Shmuel follows his opinion elsewhere. The Amar Shmuel in Kiddush al Makam Suda. Now Shmuel said that in order to fulfill the obligation of Kiddush, which the Torah obligates, as we said, to Zachrei Zachar Shabbos Akacha, and Chazal said Zachrei al Yayin, to make that remembrance on wine, that has to be b'makam Seuda. It has to be done at a place of a meal, as Yeshayahu Navi says, "V'karas al Shabbos onik." The calling of Shabbos should be at the place of the pleasure of the meal. Savar minei hani mili mi bais labais. So the thought was that maybe perhaps that's only true from one house to another, from one place that constitutes its own space to another that constitutes a different space. But within one house, from one place to another, it would count as Kiddush B'Makam Suda. It would be a valid form of Kiddush if you made Kiddush in one room and moved to another. Amar Luhu Ravana Bar Tachlifa. So Ravana Bar Tachlifa said, Zivnin Sagian, many times I was together with Shmuel. And he made Kiddush on the roof. And I guess it was a common thing to make Kiddush on the roof. And with the intent of having the meal there. And then it didn't work out, whether for weather reasons or for lighting, whatever it was. They couldn't continue the meal on the roof. He had made Kiddush and came back down into the house. So he repeated Kiddush again, because the Kiddush wasn't b'makam Suda, in the place of the meal, because the meal had moved. And not only Shmuel, so we had Machlokas of Rav and Shmuel, but we now have also the next generation, Rav Huna, who was the head of the academies in the next generation. So Rav Huna Saba Ein Kiddush al B'Makam Suda. He also followed this opinion that Kiddush must be at the meal, and otherwise it's not a valid Kiddush. The Rav Huna Kaddish, and Rav Huna had said Kiddush at home. And then the candle blew out, so he had no light, and at Shabbos he can't reignite it. So what's he going to do? But he took his plate Labei Ganane de Rabba Bere to the house of Rabbi, his son, who was having a wedding meal there. The Havashraga, so there were candles there. V'kadosh v'toyim midi, and then he made Kiddush again and ate. Alma kasavei Kiddush al-Makam Suda. So he had already made Kiddush. Why do you have to make Kiddush again? So you see that he followed the opinion that Kiddush can only be said at the place of a meal, and you have to, if the Kiddush you made before it was enough, you didn't fulfill, and you have to make it again. V'af Rabba Sabar Ein Kiddush al-Makam Suda. Rabba, next generation as well, said Kiddush is only in a place of a meal. The Amar Abaye, as Abaye, the student and stepson of Rabba, said, Amar Abaye ki havina beimar, when I was in the house of the teacher, Rabba, ki hava mekadesh amalan, when we would make Kiddush, he would say, when he would make Kiddush for and fulfill it for us, and we would listen, he would say to imumida, you must eat before you go. Dilma as the azlisu shpiza, because before you go to your own homes, misakra l'chushraga, maybe your candles will not be lit anymore. V'loy mekadesh l'chu, you won't be able to make Kiddush at home, and you're not going to end up having Kiddush in a place where you eat. And this Kiddush doesn't cover you unless you eat. Because Kiddush is only in a place of a meal. Now, so we have Rav who says, oh, Kiddush can be made anywhere. And even the Kiddush that you say in Shul, you'll fulfill your obligation to Kiddush. And the only reason to repeat Kiddush at home would be if there are some people who didn't go to Shul and didn't hear the Kiddush in Shul. So you're going to make the Kiddush for them. How can you say, and Shmuel disagrees and says, no, Kiddush has to be Makim Suda, and the next generation Rav Huna as well, and the next generation Rabbah as well, and as Abaye stated. Now, the problem is, how can we say that Rabbah followed the opinion of Shmuel, and to say that Kiddush has to be at a place of a meal, otherwise the Kiddush is not valid? Rav disagreed with that. V'ha'amar Abaye, and Abaye told us elsewhere a general rule. So Gemara asks, Eini, it's not so. V'amar Abaye said, Kol mili damar, all of the matters, halachic matters of my teacher, Hava Avad Karav, he followed the opinion of Rav, who was the contemporary of Shmuel, a little older, and the head of the academy in Surah. So Labar Mehani Tlas, besides for these three things where Rav and Shmuel disagreed, the Avid Kishmuel, where he followed the opinion of Shmuel. Which three things? Matira mi beged lebeged. Rav, who was of the opinion that you're not allowed to take tzitzis, the tzitzis off of a garment, a four-cornered garment, in order to put it onto another garment. You can't do that. And Shmuel says that no, you're allowed to take the tzitzis off of one talis, a one garment, and put it onto another. And Rabbah would follow the ruling of Shmuel in this one matter, as well as a madlika mener liner in regards to the Hanukkah candles. That if you can light one candle from the other, from another Hanukkah candle, even though that you're not supposed to benefit from the Hanukkah lights, but to light another Hanukkah candle, that would be permissible. And in the third halacha that he followed Shmuel was in regards to the halacha of Rabbi Shimon. Now, Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion in Shabbos, since you need melechas machshavos, you need intentional action, and it has to be a constructive action that you are doing with intent. Rabbi Shimon says, in regards to greira, in regards to dragging a bench or a chair on soil, that it's permissible. The Tanya, as we learned, Rabbi Shimon says, "Gerer adam mita kisav asafsal." A person is allowed to drag a bed, a chair, a bench, b'Shabbos, as long as there is no specific intent to make a furrow, a ditch, and you're just pulling it, and it's not, as the Gemara tells us elsewhere, and it's not absolutely for sure going to happen. So therefore, you can't count as your intentional act. So when you drag this chair, and it may or may not make a furrow, and you don't care about that, you're not intending for that. You're just intending to pull the chair, and if it makes a furrow, so be it. That is permissible on Shabbos, and Rabbi Shimon permits that. And Rav said, no, that's not the halacha. Shmuel says, yes, indeed, that is the halacha. You're allowed to pull something on Shabbos if that's not the intent. And Rabbah followed Shmuel in this as well, to be lenient and say that you're allowed to follow Rabbi Shimon to pull a bench. In any case, so we see that Abaye told us that only in these three matters did Rabbah, his teacher, stepfather, and only in these three matters did Rabbah follow Shmuel. So how can you tell us that in regards to Kiddush b'Makom Suda, where Rav says you don't require a meal at Kiddush, and Kiddush is valid even if it's not at the meal, and Shmuel says no, Kiddush is only valid at a meal, and you'll have to repeat Kiddush if you didn't have a meal together with the Kiddush? How can you say Rabbah follows the opinion of Shmuel? That's not one of the three things listed. Rav says, yeah, K'chumer de Rav hava ovid, K'kule de Rav lo hava ovid. It does. What he means is, in all matters, he was strict like Rav, besides for 3 times where Shmuel was lenient. However, he did. Rabbah would follow other stringencies of Shmuel, and that's what this previous statement of Abaye was. Abaye said, Rabbah would follow all of the stringencies of Rav, besides for in 3 cases that he was lenient like Shmuel. As far as Rav's leniencies, like over here, where he says that Kiddush is valid even if it's not at a meal, which is a leniency, Shmuel is stricter in the obligations, where he says that it has to be done at a meal. There, sometimes he followed Rav, sometimes he followed Shmuel. So we have this machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, whether or not the Kiddush that's made in shul will be a fulfillment of Kiddush, even though it's not at a meal, or no, it's not a fulfillment of Kiddush because it needs to be at a meal. But both agree that the Borei Pri Hagafen on wine that was made in shul will not cover the Borei Pri Hagafen at home. And that's not going to be a fulfillment of the obligation of Birchas Hananim, the bracha just for benefiting from the food, which is the bracha that somebody would make Borei Pri Hagafen on the wine itself. So that fulfillment of wine would not be fulfilled, and when the person comes home, they would have to make Kiddush again. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afi de Kiddush, afi de yayin nami yatsa." Rabbi Yochanan says, "No, you even fulfill the obligation of Kiddush, and that would be valid." And not only Kiddush, even the bracha of wine, Borei Pri Hagafen, would be valid, and you would not have to repeat the Borei Pri Hagafen when you get home. Va'azar Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei. Rabbi Yochanan follows his opinion elsewhere. Amar Rabbi Chana bar Abaye, Amar Rabbi Hadas, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Because Rabbi Chana bar Abaye said in the name of Rabbi Hadas, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Echad shinu yayin, ve'echad shinu makom, ein tzarich levarich. That even if you changed from one bottle of wine to another, from one barrel of wine to another, you don't have to make a new bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen. In other words, I may have thought that since I finished one bottle, that's sort of a hesach hadas, that's a break in my intent of drinking, because I finished one bottle, I finished one barrel, I'm done with the wine I have, and now I'm bringing a new wine. So perhaps I would require, and that's a new beginning of drinking. That's a new intent, and so I would need another Borei Pri Hagafen. To that we say you do not require another bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. That's a shinui yayin, a change of wine that does not require a bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. Again, a 4 bracha. Well, if we have time at the end, we'll get back to Hatov HaMeitiv, that there is a requirement of a new bracha in a different way. A bracha for bringing another barrel of wine, another wine, and we say Hatov v'Hameitiv. We'll hopefully get time to jump back to that. So Rabbi Yochanan says, just for changing a barrel of wine and bringing a new bottle that you finish one, you bring another, that doesn't require a new bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. And now on Amid Beis, and ve'echad shinu makom, and also a change of place. So you made a bracha Borei Pri Hagafen at home, and then you move to another house and continue drinking there. That does not require a new bracha, and that's not going to be considered a hesach hadas, a change of intent. Beforehand you were drinking, and now this is a new intent, and it requires a new bracha. So you don't need a new bracha. So the Gemara is going to challenge this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the Kiddush you made in shul, not only would you have fulfilled the Kiddush, but also if you're drinking more wine at home, you don't have to make another Borei Pri Hagafen, because the Borei Pri Hagafen from shul counts. So we ask a contradiction. Shinu makom tzarich levarich. The Brisa says that when you make a change in a place that you were at, you have to make a bracha. Shinu yayin ein tzarich levarich. However, if you change the wine, that's not enough of a break, and you don't have to change and make a new bracha. Ein tzarich levarich. So the Brisa clearly contradicts Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan, being an Amora of the Gemara era, Rabbi Yochanan is the contemporary of Rabbi Shmuel, was the head of the academy in Eretz Yisrael, and so he is post Mishnaic era, and he wouldn't argue on a Mishnah or a Brisa. And if we have a text of a Brisa that contradicts Rabbi Yochanan, so that is a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan, which would negate his opinion in this. So to Yufta Rabbi Yochanan, this is a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan. To Yufta, indeed, it is a contradiction, and this bracha, the Shinu Makom, does require a new bracha. Now we'll see later a caveat that there are times that Shinu Makom would not require a bracha, and that's really a new bracha, and that's really what the next section of the Gemara is going to get to. So Yosef Rav Ade bar Avin, Kamei Rav Chisda. Rav Ade bar Avin was sitting in front of Rav Chisda. Yosef Rav Chisda v'ka'amar mishmei Rav Huna. And Rav Chisda repeated a teaching in the name of Rav Huna. Rav Chisda was a student of sorts of Rav Huna, even though that they had the Gemara tells us they had a falling out. But Rav Chisda's quoting Rav Huna is his colleague Rebbe here. Ada Amris Shinu Makom Tzarich Avarich. And it says that we said that when there's a change in place, that you had begun the eating in one place, and then you move to another place, that you have to make a new bracha, because that constitutes a hesach hadas, that constitutes a break in the intent of eating, and the new place requires a new bracha because it's a new intent of eating. That's only true if it's from one house to another house. So which really would be their houses, as the Gemara tells us many times, it's really one room, from one room to another room. Exactly how much of a break or a space change would be needed in order to count as a new space is not really the primary place for these halachas. The Gemara has these in brachos as well. We saw it in any case, but over here we learn that shinu makom, a change, is only if it's from one what constitutes one space to another space. Avam makom lamakom, or mipina lapina, from one corner of the room to another corner of the room, one space within that space, it will not need a new bracha. That means you're at a wedding. There are many tables. It's a large room, and you were sitting at one table, and you get up and you join friends at another table, perhaps 100 feet away. It's the other end of the room, and nevertheless, you would not need a new bracha. Amalei Rav Idi bar Avin. So Rav Idi bar Avin said to Rav Chisda, as he taught this teaching of Rav Huna, indeed, we have a brisa that concurs with this in a brisa that was taught in the academy of Rav Hinak. Bar Hinak. Some say it was the academy of Bar Hinak. Kavasech, like this teaching. The Gemara challenges Vela Rav Huna Masnita Kamashmalan. Rav Huna, this that Rav Chisda was quoting Rav Huna, he was teaching something that's already explicit in a brisa. So the Gemara says, no, that's not really a question. Rav Huna Masnita Lishmile. Rav Huna may not have heard the brisa that was taught in Bar Hinak's or Rav Hinak's academy. In other words, that this wasn't the popularly known brisa. And Rav Huna had received this as a teaching from his teachers, and so he repeated it not as a brisa, but as a halachic teaching, not knowing that it was already in a text available in one academy. The Suyas of Rav Chisda. Now the Gemara tells that there was another time that Rav Chisda was sitting, and he taught this teaching without quoting Rav Huna, his own teaching. This that we say, that there's only a requirement to this that we say that when there's a change in place, that you move from one place to another, you have to make a new bracha, because that constitutes a shinui makom. Now, to understand this halacha, need an introduction in the various types of foods that need a bracha and its after brachas. The halacha is that anything we eat, we put into our mouths, other than water if we're not thirsty, we always have to make a bracha. The for bracha is going to be specific to the general category of what kind of food it is. If it grows from a tree, it's bar pri eitz. If it grows from the ground, and bar pri hadama, etc. Now, that bracha covers the intentional eating, the intent of eating at that space at that time. It doesn't last forever, right? So if you intended to stop eating where you are, you're done. Any change in place could constitute or would constitute an end of that eating session. It's not a meal necessarily, because if you just had an apple, it's not going to be a meal. But when you finish the apple and then you move on and you go somewhere else, you can't say, well, I made a bracha on the apple over there. Well, you moved on. That constitutes a new space, a new intention of eating. The original intent is done, and so the bracha worked for as long as you were intending to eat in that session, and that eating session is over. However, there's an after bracha required as well, and the after bracha for, in our example, an apple would be borei nefashos, which is a general after bracha that just says you created souls, people, and what they're missing, and thank you for everything you created to fulfill that lack. And so that's a very general after bracha, and that is not require that you have said the after bracha in its place. If you missed it, you don't have to go back and say the after bracha in its place. However, there are certain foods such as that need benching back in its place. If you ate bread and you had a meal and you're done with your meal and you go on and you say, oh my goodness, I didn't say the after bracha, I didn't bench in where I ate. You really are supposed to go back and say the after bracha in the place where you were. So that is a stringency of benching, and that's the same is true for me'ein sheva, for al hamichya. If you had a piece of cake, or if you had wine, or if you had grapes, or some of the fruit that are part of the blessing of Eretz Yisrael, so you would go back and make the bracha in its place. Now that's a stringency, but it also, in our conversation, is a leniency. Why is that? So Rav Chisda is about to explain. Since, sorry, what was that, John?
So I'm trying to understand if, when I guess I would say the bracha, because it could be either before you eat or it could be after you eating, is the determination of which bracha to make related to the specific item that you ate, or is it the session of eating that you're having, or is it tied to the location where you're having the food?
Well, it's actually the first two. So first of all, the food, each food that you're going to have is going to be based on what you're about to eat. If you haven't eaten anything of that category yet, you would have to make a bracha. Also, the eating session is relevant, unless it's a part of a meal and you've already said the bracha on hamotzi, so that would cover everything in the meal. So the fore bracha, and therefore also often the after bracha, is going to be dependent upon what you're eating, the item, as well as the session, meaning what kind of the eating session is this? If it's a meal and you've had bread, so the foods of the meal are going to be included in that bracha, covered by that bracha. If it's not, so I had an apple, that the bracha would work for that, and anything that's related to that the bracha is ha'etz would be included in that. But if I now get another food, whether it's I'm going to have a drink or I'm going to have a piece of cake, I'm going to have to make a bracha for that separately. That's in that session. But even another apple, if I had moved to another session, meaning I stopped eating, I'm done, and then a half hour later, I say, you know what, I need another snack to get me through the day, and I take another apple, that's a new bracha because I've already ended in my mind my eating session before. So the bracha that I had said is not going to cover cover this. Here, there's another concept that Rav Chisda is about to introduce, and this is, since certain foods I have to go back to say the after bracha, or at least I'm supposed to go back to say the after bracha. So you can't tell me my eating session has ended. In fact, it hasn't, because I'm still supposed to go back and say the after bracha. And until I've done that, that eating session is not done. So I had a piece of cake at home, and I left and I went to the neighbor, and now they're serving cake. And I said, wait, I had cake at home. Whoa, but I left. We just learned shinu makom. That's an end of the session. That it mentally is an end of eating, and the bracha that you made beforehand is ended because it's a hesach hadas. This constitutes a change of intent. I'm now in another place, and the bracha beforehand won't work. Rav Chisda says, wait, but since my obligation is to go back and make a after bracha, which I hadn't done yet, so that essentially tells me that my eating session is not over, and my intent is still to continue eating until I make the after bracha, and therefore I do not need it does not require a new bracha. And if I'm in a neighbor's house and I'm going to eat a cookie there, I would not need a new bracha. So that's what he's saying over here. So the stringency of the obligation of going back to say the after bracha is the factor in a leniency of allowing for a new a continued eating without a new bracha. That's only in items that don't require an after bracha in its place, and that's for foods that don't have a specified after bracha. But specified after brachas, such as the bracha for wine, the after bracha for wine, or for fruit from that are part of the blessed Eretz Yisrael, or bread, or mezonos, or cake, and five that which are from the 5 grains. So ein tzarich levarich. So there you do not need a new bracha when you go to another place. And what's the reason? My time. Lekiva kama hadar. You're still attached to the original established time. You're still attached to the first kviyos, your first set meal or set eating session, because you still have to go back for the bracha, so that bracha never ended. However, Rav Sheshes says no such distinction, even if it's a bracha that requires an after bracha going back, but your intent is to have completed that eating session. You come here, this is a new eating session, and therefore that would require a new bracha. So the Gemara is now going to challenge from a brisa to try and prove this. A group of people sat down to have some drinks together. They're having wine. And now they get up, and this is akru raglei means it's a form of show of change. We're done. They get up to go out, and why? Likras chasad. They heard a wedding procession go by to greet the groom, likras kala, or to greet the bride. Kashehin yotzin. When they go out, ain't tu in a bracha lemafreya. Kashay chayzer. When they go out, they don't have to make a new bracha. Bari priagafen, a 4 bracha before the eating when they come back. Sorry, kashen yitzin and tuna bracha lemafreya kashen chayzer and tuna bracha lachila. They don't need a bracha on the food that they just had, on the wine they just had, meaning an after bracha. And when they come back, they don't need a bracha to start again. However, the brisa says a caveat. When is this true? When somebody who couldn't leave and join the procession stayed behind. And this is typically either somebody that's elderly or ill, because otherwise they would have joined the wedding procession as well. So since somebody was left at the table, so 6 people had sat down to have drinks together. They said Borei Pri Agafen. They drank, and they're having their wine. They're sipping on it and schmoozing, and then they hear the wedding procession get up. 5 of them get up and leave to join the wedding procession. When they don't have to make a bracha before leaving, and they don't have to make a new bracha when they come back. And this is because they left someone at the table. Now we can see. But if they didn't leave anybody there, meaning all 6 people that were sitting got up and walked out to join the procession, before they leave, they must say a bracha to complete their eating session. Thank you, Hashem, for the wine. And then when they come back, they make a new bracha on going back to drinking. So the leaving constitutes a break, a hesach hadas, a change in intent. Now, from the fact that it says they uprooted their feet, that means that was a kind of session that required them to remain where they were and say the bracha there, and therefore it's termed as uprooting their feet, meaning they uprooted themselves from something that locked them there. And yet it's only because they left someone there that they're exempt from making an after bracha and a new bracha. But if they had all left, as the end says, the kashen yotzen ein tuna bracha l'mafrei, kashen chayzen ein tuna bracha l'chatchila. But if they didn't leave anybody there, kashen yotzen tuna bracha l'mafrei, or kashen chayzen tuna bracha l'chatchila, it says that they do require another bracha. Kashil or Rav Chisda. So this is a contradiction to Rav Chisda. So again, Rav Chisda had said that the stringency of halacha, that certain foods you have to go back and make the after bracha in its place, that's indicative of the fact that as long as you didn't do that, you're still in that established eating session. Even if you left, since you have to come back and make an after bracha there, you're still in that eating session. You're still in the kaviyas, in that established session of eating or drinking, in as this case of the Bryce is, and therefore you would not need a new bracha when you go even to a new place. Yet the Brisa says that if you all had left, meaning that you drank wine, so therefore you have an obligation of an after bracha in its place. That's the Me'ein Sheva, that's the Al HaGefen, that you're going to say for after bracha of wine, and you have to do that in that place. So these people that hopped out to join the wedding for a bit, and they're going to come back in, they have to come back for the bracha, for the after bracha if they hadn't said it. And so therefore, that should continue the established meal according to Rav Chisda, the established drinking session. And yet, the Brisa says if nobody's going to remain, they're going to have to come back and say the after bracha. Yet the Brisa says before they go, they should make the after bracha because this is the end of the session. They're leaving constitutes an end of the session, and when they come back, they're going to make a new bracha because the previous session is over. So we see a contradiction to Rav Chisda. Amar Nachum Yitzchak Mantana Kiris Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll begin this tomorrow. That this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and we'll see a new opinion according to. We'll see a brisa that actually distinguishes leaving a meal, leaving someone behind or not. Two opinions. Let's leave that for tomorrow, and let's jump back to the halacha that we wanted to discuss about Shinu Yayin. Rabbi Yochanan had said, and this was contradicted from the Brisa, that Shinu Yayin and Shinu Makim both ein tzarich havarich. A change of wine and a change of place do not require a new bracha. However, the Brisa says no, and a change of place. You left where you were. You need a new bracha. That constitutes a break in the drinking session. It's a new drink when you come to wherever you were going, and you require a new Bara Priya Gafet. And we're in the midst of that conversation with Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes and the Brises to prove that, which will continue tomorrow. However, Rabbi Yochanan also said just changing the bottle of wine. I finished one, I bring a new one. That doesn't constitute a change. The intent, even though I made the bracha on this bottle, on this grape, it was a Merlot, and now you're bringing a cab, that's not going to constitute a new bracha. However, Rashbam and Tosas, they point out that's only in regards to the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen. However, there's another bracha made on a Shinu Yayin. This is the bracha of Hatov V'Hametiv, the bracha of emulating the ways of Hashem in Mahu Racham Af Ata Racham, just as He is compassionate, you compassionate. So when we share something good that we have, and we share that with someone else, so we are emulating the ways of Hashem, and so we say a bracha Hatov V'Hametiv, that you Hashem are good and share in your goodness. So too we are sharing a goodness with someone else, and you make the bracha. And there are Hatov V'Hametiv, and there are many scenarios where this bracha Hatov V'Hametiv would be made when sharing good news or a good or a good item with someone else. and sharing a better wine, or a good wine actually, is the same. Now, there's a machlekes here in Rashbam and Tosas. What requirements are there for this new bracha? So when somebody had a bottle of wine or a barrel of wine, that is complete. So they are now finished one, and they're bringing a new bottle to the table, and it wasn't on the table beforehand. So when they made the Borei Pri Hagafen, that wasn't there yet. So that was out in the counter, in the wine storage area, and they're going to bring a new wine. You make a new bracha, shinu yayin. The change of wine doesn't require a new Borei Pri Hagafen, but it does require hatov hametiv. But Rashbam says this is true if you're changing to a better wine. Tosfos says no, that it does not require a better wine. In fact, the Gemara first suggested that in the Gemara in Brachos that if you went from a newer wine to an older vintage, or to a white wine, which is considered a better wine, that would require it. But then the Gemara quotes a statement which seems to be contradictory, because it says that for each barrel they open, that Rav Huna Abba Bar Huna would make a new bracha for each barrel. And Tosfos takes that to indicate that even if it is not a better barrel, meaning not a better wine, or at least you don't know if it's a better wine, you still would say Atov HaMetiv, as long as you don't know that it is inferior wine. And this is unclear as to the custom exactly how far to take this, but it is the custom that I saw by my father and many Rabbanim, and this is the halacha that you do say Atov HaMetiv if you didn't have a certain wine on top of at the table when you said Borei Pri Hagafen, and a new wine is brought to the table, and that wine is being shared with someone else at the table, you're not drinking alone. So then you say the bracha Atov HaMetiv for the better wine that's being brought, and this would be true for multiple wines as long as it is not a inferior wine. It's not bad. And as we know with wines, it's always going to be a matter of taste. Some people like one wine better than the other, but it seems that as long as it is objectively not an inferior wine, meaning it's not bad, so then the bracha would be said Atov HaMetiv for sharing in the goodness of the blessings that we have, and sharing with someone else that we recognize the source of the good that we have, that Hashem is Hatov, the source of goodness, Umetiv, and does good with all, and we are learning to emulate of Hashem's ways in sharing of the goodness. So this is the bracha Atov HaMetiv, even though Rabbi Yochanan said that there's a shinu yayin, a change of wine, does not require a bracha. It's only in reference to the Borei Pri Hagafen. It does not reference the Atov HaMetiv, which would be a requirement based on these ideas. If it wasn't there at the table when we started, you're sharing it with someone else, and there's and it is at least a good wine. Jules, you had a question?
No, I'm sorry. I was just gonna.
No problem. So just to end off where we're up to, and so we're going to continue tomorrow. We saw that the halacha is that when somebody's eating, there is a break in their intent when they change places and they require a new bracha for the food that they're continuing to eat, because change of place constitutes a change. Rav Huna Rav Chisda limited that to only items that you're not required to make a bracha go back and make a bracha, because the fact that you have to go back and make a bracha constitutes a continuation or a sort of a lock in that place. So your eating or drinking session continues until you come back and make that bracha, so you can continue where you are without a new bracha. Rav Shesha said, no go, that's not true. And we're going to look at, we have a brisa that seems to contradict Rav Chisda. Tomorrow we'll respond to that and continue with that.